thank you all for coming to this first post-lunch speech. And our first speaker is Mitu Khandaker-Kokoris. And Mitu's list of achievements and accolades is pretty lengthy and very hard to summarize, but I'll try to give you the Cliff's Notes. Mitu is a frequent presence at game conferences all over the world, and she has given numerous keynotes, lectures, and rants at the Game Developers Conference in particular, maybe, where she's also on the advocacy committee for equality. She also runs her own indie game development studio called the Tiniest Shark, which released the game Red Shirt, which was very well critically received. And she is also the creative director at Mobius AI. She has also been awarded 2 BAFTAs, one in 2013 for Breakthrough Brit, and one in 2014 for Creative English Trailblazer. And somehow, in parallel to all of this, she's also managed to finish a PhD. I don't know how that's even possible, but it happened, which she finished in 2015, and she has recently made her own little personal Brexit to New York, where she works as an assistant professor at the NYU Game Center. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Mitu.
I like that, personal Brexit. Thanks so much, Bjorn. So hi, I'm Mitu. And so I'm a game designer and programmer, amongst other things. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I actually work on shortly. So my talk today is titled Integrating Procedural Generation and Personal Expression. But before I begin, I just want to reassure those of you in the room who aren't programmers that this is not a technical talk, okay? So don't worry too much about that. And to reassure you of that even further, before I continue, I know you've all just come back from lunch. You might be a bit sleepy, so let's just take some time out and watch and listen to some soothing birds. If we can have some audio. So I really love that installation, and it is relevant, but I'll come back to how later. So while my first act of deception was to lure you all into the room and make you watch some birds, my second act of deception is that by procedural generation, what I actually mean is not PCG, procedural content generation, right? Because I actually mean it in a much more broad way. Because PCG can be very limiting. So the term that I prefer is generative methods, which is a term coined by Kate Compton and her co-authors, which kind of looks at any kind of functions, usually algorithmic, which produce some kind of artifact. Because PCG, procedural content generation, really sort of underscores the content part, right? Which means it leaves out a whole host of ways in which we can think about generative systems, whether it's AI in games or procedural narrative or computational music and so on. So what I'm going to talk about is how this relates to this, and how for at least the last 50 years, we've been making the same mistakes over and over when it comes to how we talk about and how we receive both of these categories of things. Okay, and then obviously the theme of this conference this year is inclusive game development. And we've been talking a lot about the different ways that we talk about inclusion in games. Obviously there's the ever-present call for greater representation of different types of characters and narratives. That's a conversation that we've all had and that I've been a part of over the years as well, and that's great. But also, we need to think about the call for greater representation amongst developers, right? Because that's also super important. Then there's also the call for more kinds of stories by more kinds of people. Games to reflect the wonderful breadth of human experience and tell stories, really authentic stories, by people whose voices have been marginalized within the history of games. Now, I won't get into the politics of so-called empathy games, and I say that as someone who did a doctorate in games and VR and empathy, but that's a talk for another day. But what I will say is when we talk about personal games, don't use this term, because it is not at all inclusive, it is very othering. To get back on topic, it's no secret that these are all wonderful, that there are all these wonderful developers and artists making these beautiful, really explicitly personal and expressive games about their own experiences, giving us these playful means through which to explore and reaffirm and find solace in the familiar, or for perspectives outside of our own, a new lens through which we can interrogate the unfamiliar. And people have been making these types of games for a long, long time. It's kind of hidden in the sort of history of games that people have been doing this for a while. But over the last decade, we've obviously noticed that it's much easier as well to create those kinds of games. There's lots of tools for doing so. So that means there's an even wider audience of potential games makers than ever before, that we're seeing more games than ever before expressing the personal. From examples of games based primarily around twine, like Anna Anthropy's Oh My God, Are You All Right? About the real actual time that Anna was hit by a car and taken to hospital, or Cara Ellison's Sacrilege, exploring sex and uncertainty. Or Laura Dreamfield's Curtain, exploring abusive relationships, or Nina Freeman's Sybil, a game about an MMO-based romance, a story of hers which is intensely and overtly autobiographical. Such games can be a kind of catharsis for its creators, games which help the creator deal with deep personal losses, grieving over the closest loved ones. For instance, That Dragon Cancer is a famous example of that. But also even to Kanye West's upcoming game about his late mother Donda, right? So we've often talked about games being this kind of conversation between creator and the player. A designer crafts an interactive system that aims to communicate some sort of meaning to the player, and the player discovers their own interpretation of that meaning by interacting with the system. The game is a dialogue strictly between player and designer in that model, right? And the medium itself is simply an intermediary in that conversation. The medium is a medium. All of those games I've just talked about express something about their creators' inner lives, and there's something incredibly brave about that. The courage needed to talk about something about that kind of vulnerability and to put that forward. And in doing so, those games are designed to communicate something highly specific and predefined by the author. But as I was doing my own thinking about all of this, I started wondering about my own voice and my own sense of expression as an author, as a creator, because I realized there are lots of complex reasons why I don't make those kinds of highly defined, highly sort of specifically scripted games. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. So just to talk about some games I have made, I made a game a couple of years ago called Red Shirt, which if you've seen it or played it, looked like this at the time. I've been reskinning it over the last year, and we'll get a re-release at some point where it will look like this. But basically, it's a social networking on a space station simulator. And that's the kind of the space I like to work in, where it's less about authoring a specific story and more providing the player with the means to discover their own story, their own stories which spring from the underlying systems within the game. And I suppose a large part of my interest in these kinds of games is in sharing the opportunity for an authorial voice with the player, helping the player understand that their interaction with these systems themselves is its own kind of authorship. So just playing here is the current game that I'm working on, Little Invasion Tales. And that's a game which is really about emphasizing that relationship, right? That whenever you interact with a set of systems, there is a story that is generated, and we implicitly build a story in our heads from these interactions that we have with the system. And this is a game about making that relationship more explicit, making the implicit explicit. So that'll be out sometime early next year. As Bjorn mentioned briefly, I've also become involved in the sort of tool space regarding all of this. I'm one of the founding team behind Mobius AI, which is all about using AI to make games meaningfully better in lots of ways, like having real expressive conversations with characters. What is the equivalent of a walking simulator for conversations, for example? So the kind of expressive personal communication I'm particularly interested in doing through games is one which includes the machine itself as another agent of expression, beyond just the player and the creator. The machine is this sort of third participant in this playful conversation, contributing to it equally with whatever it's decided to be the most appropriate. In this way, we can see the computer itself as a kind of expressive artist too, making its own decisions via algorithmic serendipity. Speaking of serendipity, so this is a poster from the 1968 exhibition Cybernetic Serendipity, which is the first ever celebration in the world of generative machine art, and it was held at the ICA in London. And it promoted the work of all these pioneering artists who used the medium of the computer or the machine in order to respond to external inputs from people walking around the space and react accordingly, often in unforeseen or unexpected ways. Here are some examples, which I won't go into in too much detail. The first one here is called the Sound Activated Machine, or SAM, which was the first moving sculpture which actually moved directly according to the noises that were going on around it. This one here is a video I'll only play like a very quick amount of, but essentially it's like very weird Cronenbergian computer built from bones and other things. It's very strange. But it's also wonderful. Okay. So a book was produced to accompany that exhibition, and I love that it came with this really wonderful glossary, which if you read it, gives definitions of words like online or programming language or software, because these were all sort of, not known in the mainstream terms at the time. My favorite definition in that glossary is this really eccentric listing for simulation. And it actually explains what a simulation is in terms of a limerick. And the limerick says, "The coach on the blackboard did scrawl his trickiest play of the fall. Though his simulation drew quite an ovation, the quarterback fumbled the ball." And that's kind of an interesting, sensible definition, right? It's conveying the necessity of execution, of simulations being these process-based representations, representations of something which unfold over time. The press also recounted a brief etymology of the word serendipity, which refers to this old Persian fairy tale about these three princes of Serendip who would basically go wandering about in search of something, but then the things they would find actually ended up being more interesting than the thing they set out looking for. So it's all about these happy chance discoveries. So the word serendipity came about to convey that sort of faculty of those happy chance discoveries. And so it was that sense of serendipity in their art that drew those artists. They would talk about the excitement of when a program took on a life of its own as the image emerged kind of out of nothing. They continually talked about this sort of thrill of unexpected possibilities. And there's a quote here, which was in the program, actually, I think. There's an artist as well who said, "Even though my work process is rational and systematic, its results can be unpredictable. Like a journey, only the starting point and a hypothetical destination are known. What happens during the journey is unexpected and surprising." So to further underscore this point, the exhibition material stated, through the use of cybernetic devices to make graphics, film, and poems, as well as other randomizing machines which interact with the spectator, many happy discoveries were made. Speaking of randomness, randomizing machines, which is kind of what I'm talking about here, which I'll get onto. This is called Gaussian Quadratic, which is a 1963 creation by artist Michael Knoll. And he tried to copyright this image, but it was actually rejected for copyright on the grounds that a machine generated the work. And he tried to really patiently explain to these folks that a human being still set up the system, and it was actually a combination of incorporating randomness in order and in very specific ways. But it was still rejected over and over. And it was only accepted when he said that actually it only seems random, but it's the result of math equations. So there was this sort of weird fight that he was having in trying to get computer art accepted. And maths is very obviously and inextricably woven into every layer of computational art. There is an argument that the history of art goes through these periods where the interrelationship of art and maths becomes like really strong sometimes. The Renaissance and its use of maths to figure out perspective and divide up like pictorial space was one of those instances, for example. But here was art. So these early practitioners of generative art were doing this practice in which that relationship between math and art was very explicitly foregrounded. And it was foregrounded for the practitioners as well. Many practitioners, many of those artists actually specifically wanted to do this because they wanted to distance themselves from their art, as if the sort of abstract world of maths combined with the autonomous nature of the machine was what distanced them. And that idea of authorial distance comes up again and again. There were these commonalities with computational art and what was known as the conceptual art movement. For instance, the art of Sol LeWitt was a set of these algorithmic procedures because he believed that the idea itself, the algorithm itself, was the work of art, and maintained that, like an architect who like draws up the blueprints and then someone else goes off and builds it, that is the art. So an artist should be able to conceive of a work and then delegate its production to someone else. And so that's what Sol LeWitt did. He wrote these instructions, and then people would go and follow those instructions to create these installations. So there's this idea of the suppression of authorial presence, which is really interesting. There's a decoupling of that relationship between the artist and the art object, achieved through mitigating all signs of personal intervention, as Sol LeWitt said. So outsourcing the creative process to the machine. So as an artist, you're like, no, that was not my work. It was the machine that did it. I didn't have anything to say. And Sol LeWitt himself said, art is not about making choices. It's about making an initial choice of, say, a system and letting the system do the work. All the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. So it's kind of, making the same point before, that he set up the algorithms in such a way that that is the art itself, and then it doesn't really matter if you make it or not. It doesn't matter if it ends up executing in a certain way or not. And we can apply that to lots of types of objects, right? Including even wind chimes, for example, right? So these are designed objects. You're setting the starting conditions. You're choosing what material you're using to make the wind chimes, how long they are, what configuration they're in. So you're designing the thing as an object, and then you're sort of waiting to harness the wind, the apparent randomness of the wind, which is actually a weather system, right? Or a better example, to go back to the birds that you watched earlier. So that was an installation by artist Celeste Bourgier-Mongeau. And as the artist, all he's doing is creating a set of starting conditions. He's creating the environment necessary for an experience to actually take place. He's the one who's tuning those guitars in the beginning and setting up the room, setting up the cymbals in a certain place just so. So he's setting that sort of reference frame, and then just like letting the finches loose. The finches are the ones who are executing the piece. And the finches aren't aren't applying volition. They're not expressing something specific. They're just doing what finches do. They're just flying about the room and like landing on the different instruments. And the gestalt of all the 70 finches is the thing that creates that particular aesthetic experience that you saw earlier. The sort of resulting experience is arrhythmic, but it's not atonal, right? The artist tuned all the instruments so that they still produced pleasing notes. But the rhythm and the order of the notes is what was determined by the behavior of the birds, doing what birds do. Just trying to... So, okay, if we transpose that thinking to computer-based generative work, the physical space and the instruments here are the sort of algorithmic definitions, right? And the randomizing component, sorry, that's spoilers there. The randomizing component, the birds are really the sort of equivalent of the computer, like actually executing the piece. So in this example, birds are computers, right? So I'm glad I've cleared up that mystery. Okay, so despite the fact that setting up those starting conditions is this specific design decision, there was this cultural misunderstanding of sort of this serendipitous art or computational art. There was this misunderstanding, and it was kind of uniformly dismissed because computers were thought of as capitalistic and soulless, the very symbol of the thing that artists sought to free themselves from, right? Artists saw themselves as being above the sort of being chained to computers. This quote is really interesting because it says, most of us do not even want a machine of any kind to succeed in conceiving any art form at all. In some ways, some of those concerns were warranted. Cybernetic Serendipity, the exhibition, was sponsored by the US Air Force. And it was this that brought to bear some additional tensions between artists and scientists, because scientists were used to getting these big, quite scary government grants. Artists were not. The most positive of articles in the New York Times expressed regret that the future would be entrusted to the Deus Ex Machina. People would be rendered obsolete and remain only as a servant to this computer artist. So scientists making computer art were seen as reductionist, reducing art to code, lacking artistic sensibility, etc., etc., etc. And it was thought of as emotionally dry. And the same criticisms were leveled towards the machine and machine art as well. But here's the thing. We're still making the same mistakes when it comes to procedural generation. We still think of computational generation as cold, soulless, or at worst, representing some objective truth. But beyond pure physics simulations, this is not the case. As soon as you start setting parameters as a game designer, you're doing conscientious reductionism. You've started making design decisions. Remember, all design, all rule setting is a kind of conscientious reductionism. We're choosing what to leave in, and often what we choose to leave out says more about our design than anything else. And I think it's exactly this tendency that's so interesting, because generative art, based on computers or otherwise, have that criticism leveled towards them, that same criticism that they're cold, devoid of meaning. But I think it's actually about moving towards a different kind of truth, one in which you, the creator, and as well as the player interacting with the system, can look for new serendipitous truths as well. So we're still making those same mistakes when it comes to procedural generation. And we can see those mistakes take effect in the reason, or rather the sort of, most of the reason within games of why we even still use procedural generation. We underestimate what procedural generation actually is and what it can do for us. So, went the wrong way. So, okay, what can procedural generation do for us? The boring but true answer is that it offers replayability, right? There are lots of different possible combinations. We can replay them, and also offers longevity. Like a player can go back and play the game again and again, and it's like, there's slightly different content every time. But the interesting answer, which is also the true answer, is that all procedural systems are driven by a philosophy. They allow us the opportunity to discover a knowledge space. And that knowledge space means there are opportunities for nuanced, thoughtful stories to be told. But one of the things that we need is to understand that artifacts produced by the computer aren't necessarily soulless. They allow us to explore the complete space of some very human ideas. So this is a screenshot, of course, of No Man's Sky. And I just want to make clear, just while I'm up here, I just want to make absolutely clear my absolute support of Hello Games and No Man's Sky. They are wonderful developers who undertook a wonderful mission. So this is not a criticism of No Man's Sky, but imagine instead if we, as a public, understood procedural systems better, understood how to read the complete space of a procedurally generated system. Because the criticism of this game should not be, oh, you're not objectively modeling the universe in the exact way I envisioned, or worse, the contradictory corollary to that, which is that there isn't enough to do. Because the very things that some unfortunate players found so objectionable about the game could be an interesting philosophical query. What does No Man's Sky tell us about generating planets? What the scope of life and the type of life forms could be in a generated environment, in a generated galaxy? It kind of says that everywhere is ultimately visitable and habitable, that there are no planets which sort of immediately kill you as soon as you visit them. And so maybe the message is actually the universe isn't this cold, inhospitable place, right? And maybe there's something quite nice and warm and fuzzy about that. So procedural narratives can allow us to explore and unpack the philosophy of an entire story space rather than just one story. And when we think about those games, it's important that we don't think of these generated spaces as being cold and objective, even though a computer, the birds, are the one executing it. We need to think of those who set up the system, who put the symbols there and why, and who put those guitars there and tuned it so and why. Because we can't keep accepting the generative truths of certain types of people as default. We need more creators, people who want to make and tell personal stories, to make them through generative means. Now, I really want to underscore that I'm not saying generative expressive systems are better than games which privilege the author. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, I really admire people who are making expressive, very sort of personal games. And I think it's incredibly brave in a way that I'm really not, or at least I feel like I couldn't be, for a number of very complex personal reasons. I just happen to feel more comfortable making games in which my co-author is the computer. And in some ways, the distance can be useful because it can be hard to put yourself out there, to expose those more personal parts of yourself. So you're sort of almost letting the machine speak for you, as it were. This is an example of personal procedural generation. This is boobscape.io by Vi Hart, who is an amazing creator, which she made as part of a feminist procedural generation workshop that we held in Canada earlier this year. And I really, this is just a GIF from it. Please go to boobscape.io and listen to the audio and everything. It's amazing. But the message of the game with these randomly generated boob-like mountains is that you don't get to choose the ones that you get, right? And it was Vi's way of expressing her sort of adolescent feelings around going through puberty. So I don't make those kinds of highly defined, highly scripted games. And like I said, there's all kinds of personal reasons why, ranging from the personal complex reasons through to just a particular aesthetic leaning I have towards the generative, from the love of the beauty of emergence and maths. The solace it offers you as a creator of sort of being distanced and being able to say things about the world without telling just your particular story, without having it being interpreted as your particular story, because you're letting the player actually understand the story space. And I think that's why distancing is so important to me. moving beyond that personal message to a larger one, created through collaboration with the player and the machine. After all my work in social simulations, it's not about my relationships per se, it's about yours, the players, but seen through those systems that I've crafted as a personal expression of what those relationships might mean. And just letting players explore that relationship and that space in a really playful way. Just quickly to wrap up, one of my favorite things to talk about is a talk given by comic book writer and actual wizard Alan Moore, entitled Snakes and Ladders, which was a talk that he gave at a magic convention several years ago. And the talk was about trying to understand what is real, let alone what is magic, right? But there's this wonderful quote where he says that humans are the mud that sat up, that through us the universe knows itself, loves itself, and breaks its own heart. And I think that's really a big part of the reason why I make games, to help players and creators better understand who we are and how we should best treat each other. So that, to me, is my version of authorship in games, of expressing ideas and a call to more people to express ideas through setting up those starting conditions, putting some cymbals and guitars in the right places, and then letting the birds loose. Thank you.